Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Extremely excited to continue our collection of off-season previews, this time focusing on the Toronto Raptors. So if you're from Canada, from Toronto, and you're a big-time Raptors fan, first of all, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on more Raptors coverage all off-season long, whether that's free agency, NBA draft stuff. This is the place to be. And if you're a fan of one of the other 29 teams, either check out the channel already. I already have Spurs and Rockets ones up on the channel, and by the time you're watching this, maybe extra ones. But if you don't see your favorite team up on the channel, go ahead, comment down below what team you would like to see me cover next. If you do enjoy, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more. Let's get into that video preview here now, where we're going to talk about this past season. I think that's the best place to start with all of these off-season previews. You have to know where the team is presently at, where they currently sit. The Raptors have been in the news with the Jontay Porter situation. I did not make a video on that, but I do want to say in this video, I think the NBA got it right. Anytime you have a player betting on games that he is either participating in or has extreme knowledge about, you're looking at a situation where the credibility of the league could be lost. So you need to have harsh consequences for that. So don't want to go on too much about Jontay Porter, but I do think the NBA handled it correctly. I wish that they would have harsher stipulations for other penalties that are more legal obligations. That's not for this video though. Then we'll talk about the 2024 NBA draft, lottery odds, as well as draft prospects I think could make a lot of sense for Masai Ujiri and the Toronto Raptors to consider, especially in round one. There's a lot of nuance with their draft pick this year. Then we'll look at their free agency situation and early outlook for next year. We'll put all of the pieces together, my rough expectations, what to expect from this team. Do they take a step forward? Do they stay as kind of a tanking team, which we saw this year? There's a lot to answer. But when it comes to this season, first of all, they finally made some of those franchise direction changing moves. Masai Ujiri, you got to give him some credit. He did bring in some talent for OG Anunoby in the form of Immanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett. They've also done a few other things this year that has opened up wiggle room for them to, first of all, keep their own draft pick, but also add other draft picks. So you think about the Pascal Siakam trade. Trading away Anunoby and Siakam, obviously two key fundamental pieces of this team over the past half decade or so. The Raptors took a big, complete 180 turn. Because of that, they lost a bunch of games, but they positioned themselves pretty well for their draft pick. We'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. But then also, they've set themselves up well for either future free agency, future team building opportunities, future opportunities in general to improve the roster, whether that's via the draft or the trade market. And I think because of that, you're going to see the Raptors be kind of at the crux of a lot of league rumors, a lot of news, because they have a surplus now of draft picks. They have a situation where they're going to be able to continue building up their collection of pieces around their star player, which is Scottie Barnes. He had a fantastic season again this year, took another stride forward. I know people were harsh and critical of him a couple seasons ago because they didn't take the jump that they were looking for. Progression isn't linear. That's an important thing to remember, not only when we consider draft prospects, but when we consider these guys in the league. Not every single year they're going to take the same kind of step forward. Sometimes they take a little slight step back, or maybe it looks like they plateaued a little bit. There's still learning involved in that, even if it's not necessarily showing in the production. And especially a game like basketball where shooting splits are such a big part of how we evaluate the game. Sometimes guys go through shooting slumps, sometimes they've got off the court stuff they're dealing with. So I think that's important to remember as well when we evaluate players. But Scottie Barnes, what a season he had, kind of ascending into an all-star caliber player, very well deserved, by the way. And I think he is really at the center and at the heart of this Raptors team going forward. Wherever they end up going in terms of how good they become, it's really going to be because Scottie Barnes has his fingerprints all over it, with his ability to make plays on both ends of the floor. I think defensively really surprised me this year. Obviously had a lot of the defensive capabilities. I think he just really applied himself this season. A phenomenal player to watch, a lot of fun. Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett. Excuse the typo there on the graphic. RJ Barrett and Quickley were both pretty impressive this year in Toronto. Obviously Barrett a good feel-good story returning back home. Same with Kelly Olynyk, which we'll talk about here in a second. But Immanuel Quickley was really the key piece of that OG Anunoby trade. And behind that, Masai Ujiri was betting that Quickley would be ready for a bigger role than what he had with the Knicks. And lo and behold, I believe he was right. Emmanuel quickly played very, very well for Toronto this year. I think we've continued to see some more steps forward in his game as a lead ball handler, decision maker. Obviously, he has downhill juice and shot creation upside and potential. And I think he's starting to realize that. I think he's starting to live up into some of that potential and really applying himself. RJ Barrett, very impressive player for them as well. Obviously, I think the one tricky thing now for Toronto is they have a bunch of good players. They don't have a bunch of great players, but they don't also have a bunch of bad players. So they're going to kind of be stuck in this weird tier of, hey, they're not bad enough to probably get the first overall pick unless they get lucky in the lottery. But they're also not in a situation where they're going to be a perennial, high octane playoff team. Maybe they can sneak into the playoffs, whether that's through the play-in or whatever. We'll talk about that at the end of the video. But this team is kind of in a weird spot where they have a bunch of guys who you're like, hey, this is a pretty good player, this is a pretty good player. They got a good player here, they got a good player there. But maybe the collection of the sum of their parts isn't as good as it could be because they're maybe missing one or two more top-end talent players, but they have, again, that flexibility to go find that. They do have a collection of role players that are quite good. Kelly Olynyk, Gary Trent Jr., Bruce Brown, obviously they acquired in a trade, Chris Boucher, and Grady Dick. And I think with those 5 guys off the bench or in whatever feasible role they find themselves in going into next season, I think the year that they just all had, Olynyk had arguably one of the best years of his career, obviously spent most of it with Utah. Gary Trent Jr. Had, I think, a pretty quality season, shot the ball extremely well at times this year. And going into a free agency period for him that's going to be pretty telling on where the league actually values him. Bruce Brown has a team option. We'll talk about that later. Grady Dick, I think, toward the back end of the season really started to show off some more things, but they were tanking around him. Javon Freeman-Liberty stood out to me watching Toronto. I think he actually probably has solidified somewhat of a role for himself in this league. I would be not shocked to see him back with the Raptors next season, but the clear and evident point for Toronto was, with all of their injuries, it made sense to turn their eyes toward the draft and toward the offseason, and because of that, they tanked a bit, kind of hurt their record, but there's no harm, no foul there. They're prioritizing the benefit of their franchise long term. They weren't going to be a team that had enough juice to be in contention or anything crazy like that anyway. The season was already almost lost with the trades that they had made, so the tanking down the stretch and losing a whole bunch of games in a row, I'm sure some Raptors fans are like, I don't want to go pay and watch that for that. I think it's a smart decision for where this franchise was. And the reason for that is when we look at the 2024 NBA Draft Lottery odds, with a top 6 protected pick, remember they owe it to San Antonio this year from the Jakob Poeltl trade, well, they found a way to get to the 6th worst record in the league, which means if no other team below them, say a Memphis or a Utah, jumps up into the lottery, well, guess what? The Raptors will be keeping their pick, and some Raptors fans might say, well, we'd rather have that pick conveyed this year anyway because it's not, it's not a very good draft, quote unquote. Listen, I think there's a lot of talented players in this draft, and I think anytime you can keep your pick, the better, and the sooner you can get talent in the door, that's exactly how you should want to operate in most cases. Now, I think some teams are a little bit different depending on their contention status and if they want to load up draft picks for future trades, this, that, and the other thing, but I think Toronto right now, getting a draft pick in, getting someone to focus their development on is definitely beneficial, and they have a very good chance. They have a roughly 37.2% chance to move up into the top 4, as well as a decent chance of just flat out keeping the pick at number 6. There is some risk though, about a 50% chance or so of them moving down one spot. That would be if any team between 7 and 14 ends up jumping them in the lottery. So that is, of course, very important and big news to watch for if you're a Raptors fan, because if you do end up getting jumped, this pick will convey to San Antonio at either pick 7 or pick 8 more than likely. So who are some draft prospects that make a good deal of sense for the Toronto Raptors in this draft cycle? And there's quite a few that I like. Stephon Castle just kind of stands out to me as a player I could see Masai Ujiri valuing and wanting to draft. He's an incredible defensive prospect. He navigates screens extremely well. I think he's got a winning attitude, a winning character to him, which I don't think is the best way to evaluate a player. I don't think you should be looking at him solely through the context of, oh, this guy wants to guard or this guy wants to win. But I think his play indicates that with the way that he is connective offensively. I don't think really plays with a chip on his shoulder in terms of selfishness. I think he plays with a chip on his shoulder in terms of making the right play, being aggressive, getting on the offensive glass, and he just feels like a gap filler for me. And I know that doesn't sound super intriguing if you're talking about a top 6 overall pick, but someone who, again, with Toronto, who already has a good collection of talent, I think he just does a lot of the little things really, really well for a team that, if they're looking to kind of improve on the margins and improve around their current core and nucleus, Stephon Castle is the type of player that I think can elevate a team into better winning, more likely to win, because of some of the things that he does on and off the basketball on both ends of the floor. Then the Kentucky guards, they're going to be on my draft prospects list for pretty much every single team in the top 10 because this draft is wide open. Really don't have a great feel on where any of these guys are going to go yet because it is ahead of the draft combine so far, but Rob Dillingham, Reed Sheppard, both of them are very, very good guards. Dillingham, a little bit more like Emmanuel Quickley, now maybe has a little bit more scoring pop and upside in the NBA, which isn't to discredit Quickley at all. It's just to credit Dillingham, who has an electric handle, very good pick and roll ball handler, but he's not nearly as good defensively as Quickley has been at times in his career, and I think that he will struggle a bit defensively. Some people look at Dillingham as a microwave scorer. I think he's more than that. I think he is someone who I would trust to run an NBA offense, and I think Reed Sheppard's one of the more connective players in this draft as well. For a lot of the reasons I highlighted Stephon Castle, I think Sheppard does a lot of things better than Stephon Castle, especially offensively. I trust him a bit more as a pick and roll ball handler. I think he's someone who is capable of making the right reads, even if it's not a high volume amount of times per game. There's not a world that exists where only one player touches the basketball and everyone else stands and watches. But even if there was a world like that, Reed Sheppard would still be really good around that type of context because he shoots the ball so darn well as well. Zachary Rissacher kind of up and down with his shooting as of late, although I think his size and defensive upside paired with his shooting would probably be intriguing to Masai Ujiri if you look at the track record of players that he drafts. He doesn't typically value shooting, but he does value length and size extremely, and I think Rissacher does fit that physical profile. Cody Williams is a player that definitely does make some sense for the way Masai Ujiri has drafted in the past. Williams, unlike a lot of the other prospects that Ujiri has drafted, actually has shot the ball extremely well. The only issue is it's on very, very low volume. I believe 41 total three-pointers this past season at Colorado. Now he shot extremely well, especially on unguarded catch-and-shoot threes, which is the type of shots the Raptors would want him to take. And he's got a lot of downhill juice, creation ability at his size and length as a small forward in the NBA probably is what he's going to translate to most likely. You look at a player who could become arguably one of the best players in this entire draft, just with his skill set. And then Donovan Clingan, this is probably a little bit of an underrated asset decision here for Toronto. I know, yes, they have Jakob Poeltl, but drafting someone like Donovan Clingan, even though center is probably not the biggest need for them right now, they traded for Kelly Olynyk, extended him. They also have, of course, like I said, Jakob Poeltl. I've long said that if you want to draft a center, you should do it a year or two before you really need them. And if Toronto is going to continue to maybe tear down parts of their roster, Jakob Poeltl could be the next to go. And I think Donovan Clingan at 7'1" gives them a unique screen setter, a real physical presence on the glass. I think he boxes out extremely well. And right now his stamina is not at a point where he's ready to play 30 minutes anyway. So I think the Raptors, even with their current setup, could probably budget out 20 minutes a game for him regardless. And then as he develops, maybe he would assume that starting center role because he's very, very good defensively. Again, great on the glass, but in drop coverage, I think his size and rim protection is really going to be the heart and crux of why you would draft him in the top 10 in this year's class. Then when it comes to NBA free agency, so we just talked about the draft, how else can this team look to improve? Well, they don't have a lot of cap space. In fact, they have negative cap space, negative $27 million in cap space, but they do have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, but they have some important pending free agents as well. Bruce Brown, he's got a team option of $23 million. Big question, will the Raptors pick that up? My assumption is yes. If not, I believe they would have traded him at the deadline once again. They decided to not do that. So for that reason, I think they will accept Bruce Brown's team option, even though it is a pretty hefty number. They can look at it as a $23 million expiring contract to take into the trade deadline next season. Then you have Gary Trent Jr., who took his player option last offseason. I was kind of surprised by that. And I think he's one of the big wild cards in free agency this offseason. What team is looking to pay a Gary Trent Jr. type player and how much? And I think that's really going to hinge on what the market looks like for him, on what Toronto has to pay him. I'm sure the Raptors would like to have him back. Darko's been very appreciative of him in some of his pressers and some of his press conferences he's held. But I do think Gary Trent Jr. is going to explore some of his options, and then depending on what those offers look like, the Raptors may or may not keep him. Emmanuel Quickley has restricted free agency status. Whether another team offers him a contract or the Raptors just outright sign him to a new contract, Quickley will be back in Toronto regardless. The Raptors have the ability to match any contract, and they will. They'll match any single contract he signs. I think the big question is, does a team go out there and pay him a stupid amount of money and force Toronto to pay him that money as well? That's going to be the big question for me. But I think Toronto will willingly do whatever it takes to keep Emmanuel Quickley. A couple of other unrestricted free agents on the roster that are worth mentioning: Jordan Nwora and Garrett Temple. Not sure exactly what to expect there from Temple. I don't think that's a priority for them. Jordan Nwora shoots the ball extremely well. So we'll see if Masai Ujiri, who has leaned into a little bit more shooting value on his roster, think about Grady Dick and Kelly Olynyk as examples, Jordan Nwora as well. I think that keeping Nwora would not be a harmful decision if they do opt to do that. So who are some targets that make some sense? Let's get some more shooting. I'm a big believer in it. They have the non-tax pyramid level exception, $12.859 million, and a guy like Malik Beasley, who is playing on the minimum this year for the Milwaukee Bucks, will be making more than the minimum, probably anywhere from $6 to $8 million, so you could split up your non-tax pyramid level exception. Beasley would be a good candidate for that because of the sheer volume of three-pointers he takes, putting that around Emmanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, putting that around Scotty Barnes and Jakob Poeltl, I think just carries a different kind of gravity and gives a little bit more life into Darko's offense, which is very ball movement oriented, and having someone like Beasley on the back end of those to finish some of those plays with long distance threes, probably a beneficial thing. Gordon Hayward, a veteran who could come in and I think just kind of fits the style that Toronto's looking to play, someone who is capable of making plays off of a live dribble, but also capable of finishing plays as well as a cutter, as a catch and shoot guy. Gordon Hayward at this point of his career, not going to get another big contract, obviously playing the final year of his big contract out right now after being traded from Charlotte to OKC. But Hayward, even though his best days are behind him, I think it's going to be similar to the Nick Batum contract, where remember Nick Batum was getting paid massively by Charlotte and everyone's like, oh my gosh, this guy's not a big deal, he's not very good, and then he signed for a minimum with the Clippers, and since then his career's just really, I think, found a really healthy place where he's just been a high impact role player. I think Gordon Hayward's going to blossom into that kind of player where he's an impactful role player. You're not expecting him to play big minutes or a super big role for your offense, but he is a nice gap filler for a team that is looking to win, and I think Gordon Hayward would be a nice presence in Toronto. Then another shooter here, Luke Kennard, who has a team option with the Grizzlies. My expectation is he will not hit free agency. I think the Grizzlies will keep him, and worst case, what they'll do is probably trade him, so maybe Toronto gets involved that way. We'll see, but I think Kennard, just like with the Malik Beasley point, just having more shooting gravity on the floor, I think would really open things up even more for Scotty Barnes offensively. And then Kelly Oubre Jr., a player who I think, again, fits that Masai Ujiri prototypical type player, a long, lengthy, athletic wing who can do a little bit of everything. Shot the ball decently this year for Philadelphia, finishes at the rim. I think his defense, we've seen a good uptick from him in the last couple of years as well. So Oubre would be an intriguing get for the Raptors, although I don't think they're going to be the most active team in free agency. They do have a little bit of wiggle room if they want to take a step forward and improve their roster. So when we get to that outlook for next season, what are we really expecting from this Toronto Raptors team? I think continuity is going to be a really big deal for this group. And, continuity for me, I do believe is an impactful barometer for measuring how much a team is going to continue to improve and win. You think about a team like Denver, who over time put their pieces together, stayed together, and then ended up winning together. I think Toronto is kind of going for that similar approach. You think about the very team-centered approach. Obviously, they've been blowing things up this past year, But I don't think the goal is to just be perennially rebuilding, and I don't think the goal is to stay bad for a super long amount of time and just tank for draft pick after draft pick after draft pick. What I think Toronto's looking to do is put together a collection of good quality NBA players, and over time, as they kind of learn Darko's system and they learn to play together and develop these interesting 2-man, 3-man actions, whether that be out of Spain screens or out of ghosts or flare screens, whatever you want it to be, Toronto's going to find creative ways to score the basketball through their continuity. So I think for them, more than any other team in the league, the way that they play, I think the more chemistry, the more continuity that they have, the better they will get. Then I think Scottie Barnes is going to take another big step forward. I think he could be a type of player that next year he goes from all-star consideration to flirting with an all-NBA spot, depending on how many games the Raptors win. Obviously, you have to go against the American media, which I don't think values Toronto players as much as they probably should. But the reality here is that Scottie Barnes is a player who, with his two-way play, ability to make plays on the defensive end of the floor, while also being a hub of the offense for Toronto, one of their main scoring threats, obviously, as well, he's going to be flirting with that All-NBA status. Emmanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett, I think they're going to settle in a bit more and find a real rhythm there as well. That's a big part of that continuity factor. Grady Dick's going to find a rhythm as well. Again, toward the end of the season, he's played a lot better. I think there's been a little bit more confidence that he's had, knowing that he's going to get a significant increase in minutes as other players were out or out of the lineup with injury, whatever it may be. Grady Dick, I think, just kind of started to find himself down the stretch of the year. And I just, watching Raptors games, it reminded me of, hey, that's exactly what he looked like at Kansas. And that's exactly what you want to see when you have a player in games 55 to 82 of the regular season, and they're starting to look more like the college film that they put on. It means that they're really settling into the league. And I think with that, next year is going to be a big build year for Grady Dick. Again, development's not linear, but what I do think is as he finds his footing, I know his jump shot plays at the NBA level. I for sure know that. And then I also for sure know that he's a capable enough athlete to attack closeouts. So with those two things, I think offensively he's going to continue to settle in more. And then it's just about the nuance of learning the defensive game at the NBA level and trying to apply his athleticism that he does have as best as he can to present himself as a challenge on the defensive end of the floor a bit. I think this team is good enough to flirt with the play-in next year. Not saying that they're going to for sure make the playoffs or that they'll for sure make the play-in. It kind of comes down to, again, health is super important. You guys have seen that this year if you're a Raptors fan. And then it also comes down to what the franchise direction really is. If they end up trading Jakob Poeltl this offseason, or if they trade Jakob Poeltl during the season next year, obviously it will cause some more shakeups and some more stirs that will kind of change the direction of this franchise a little bit more again and probably limit their win potential next year, which is okay. I'm not opposed to that by any stretch of the imagination. I think whatever Toronto has to do to position themselves for the best team that they can have 2-3 years from now, that's the way that they should go about their business. But along the way, I think they have enough talent right now to be a competitive team. Looking at what Atlanta was this year, looking at what Chicago was this year, I think the Raptors can be that level of team for sure next season if a lot of stuff goes right in terms of health and the fact that maybe they won't trade a bunch of players like they did this season. Thank you all so much for watching, Raptors fans. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.